Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the Your Gray Matters podcast. I'm Jason, back here with Neil. How are you today?
I am great. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Ready to show this week's episode. It was really interesting and obviously timely, and you're going to tell us a little bit about it, but I really enjoyed learning about the history of some of these things, like the history of why it's on the I guess I'll give it away here, why it's on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So
That's correct. I was very lucky to bring to all of us, all of we viewers and listeners, a gentleman named Tony Bratschitsch. And Tony is a specialist. He's a lead educator, a historian, and a man who really knows about Remembrance Day. Today's podcast is called Remembering Remembrance Day. And I know that everybody's going to enjoy this.
So please remember to like, subscribe. Just hit that button right below us right here that says subscribe, and you'll be in and be able to see all of our episodes. So everybody do that and enjoy.
Take care, everybody. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Neil from Your Gray Matters. Welcome back to another episode. I'm really excited today. As you know, we like to say whether you have gray hair or no hair or red hair, but come on, we know what's under there. We love to find solutions and miracles and ideas that exist that we hope will be good for you. Today, though, we're going to take a serious look. You'll see behind me, you don't see the usual Your Gray Matters logo, you see a poppy. Today's topic is remembering Remembrance Day. I know as a kid we always did, and I thought with Remembrance Day coming this week that it would be important to discuss it. I'm so lucky though, because I was looking for someone who actually knows what Remembrance Day is and can talk about it. And I was introduced 2 days ago to Tony Bratschitsch. And Tony is an amazing man. Let me tell you about him. You can see him here. Welcome, Tony. And, you know, Tony is an entrepreneur, a guy after my own heart. He owns a consulting firm. He works in environment consulting. He knows a lot about hazardous waste challenges. But this young man is also an award-winning speaker. He's a Toastmaster leader. He's a lawyer. He decided to become a lawyer. He is also, as I said, a business consultant. So if you have a business issue, Tony can likely help you. Being a Toastmaster, he has experience with public speaking. And with that, he's a great educator. So Tony, welcome. I have to ask you, with all these amazing things that you do, you sound like a pretty busy man. Why do you spend so much time remembering Remembrance Day? And also, why do you take the time to educate people on it? So Tony, welcome. And let's talk about what you do.
Thank you very much, Neil. And hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this podcast. Neil, you asked two questions. The first one was why, I believe the first one was, why do we remember Remembrance Day?
Exactly.
Right? And why am I concerned about it?
Yes.
It's gratitude. As a young child, well, I was aware of my parents' upbringing. In the Second World War, they were in different parts of Europe. My mom in Poland, my father in Yugoslavia, and both their families suffered through the war, and they came to Canada separately. They came to Canada, they met in Montreal, got married, and I was their second born. I was always grateful that I never had to go to war, such war. And I'm also grateful that my children did not have to go to war. As as a young student, I made myself familiar with all the trauma, the atrocities of war. To me, the background of Remembrance Day is that it is relatable.
Okay.
It is relevant. It is relatable because young men and young women from families put on uniforms and went somewhere else and died.
Mm-hmm.
And if they didn't die, they did not get wounded, they were still affected. They saw things that people should never see. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Sure.
For example, in the First World War, Canada, 6 million people. So that's 1/6 of today. 6 million people. We, Canadians, suffered 60,000 casualties in the First World War.
Terrible.
Those are recorded casualties of physical injuries. Fatal injuries, of course, death, and, serious wounds, loss of limb, sickness. 60,000 out of 6 million.
Boy,
Probably close to, 60,000 families. And if there was siblings, that probably even made it worse.
yes, yes.
Second highest per capita casualty ratio of the First World War.
My Lord.
We're not even in Europe.
Right.
Only Russia suffered a higher per capita casualty ratio. How and why, it's in the history books, and that's not why we're here. It's a fact that it's relatable because family members left the farms, the factories, the families, and some never came back.
Yes.
The impact on Canada was forever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Neil, often when I walk by the cenotaph in Dundas, I'll stop and I'll look at the name plaques. And if someone does any cenotaph in any town or any city in Canada, will stop for a moment, look at the name plaques, and first off, look at the wars that the plaques are attached to. In Dundas, we have a plaque that has names of young people that went to the Boer War, like 1899, 1900, a few names. We hardly ever talk about it, but there's a number of names on the Dundas cenotaph that is for the Korean police action. We don't call that a war.
Yeah.
But as far as those people that got killed or injured, it was a war.
Yes.
Of course, we know about the First World War and the Second World War. I went to Delta High School in the 60s. That's in Hamilton. We had framed pictures of mainly young men, boys, high school kids that went to war and never came back. I was a Sea Cadet in the 1960s and early 1970s, and in the Hamilton Barracks, which is RCSCC Lion, it's gone now. We had the front wall was dedicated to had the names of young people, about 40 of them,
Mm-hmm.
that were Sea Cadets that never came back.
Unbelievable.
And I remember standing there, and quite often, I was bored to tears, standing there in parade, and I would look at those names, knowing that there was a lot more behind those names, not just, oh my God, not just the love they had and the love they lost and the opportunities to get married and have kids and live their lives, but how their families were affected.
Mm-hmm.
and not just kids, Neil, sometimes, fathers were drafted in those days. Today, mothers get drafted and go to war, could get drafted. We don't do the draft now.
Yes.
We don't do conscription, but we do have women going to war
Yes,
who
we do.
actually are in the line of fire, right?
Mhm.
So these days, whatever I'm saying these days applies to the genders.
Yes.
But imagine,
It's amazing, Tony, because you walk by people of all ages and you don't know where they've come from, what their personal history is if you don't know them. Could be military, maybe non-military. They could be progeny of survivors of wars, military or non-military. But when I think of those 60,000 young lives that you mentioned, and you extrapolate what they would have had to added to our population if they had lived, this could have been millions of people that were not born because of the loss of those 60,000 people. It affects us forever when we lose somebody like this.
Neil, it was such a social phenomenon that Parliament passed an act that no statue can look like an 18-year-old.
Wow, really? Wow.
Look at the Dundas cenotaph and try to gauge how old that person is, that soldier.
Yeah.
And that cenotaph, by the way, was erected in 1921. You look at that person, that man, and he looks like he's maybe in his 30s.
Yes, I've noticed that when I've looked at them.
Yeah,
You're quite right, and I do stop and look at them, and I do read them, especially as Linda and I travel to different cities. If we see memorials, you have to stop and pay your respects. It's at least that's my belief system. But Tony, Remembrance Day is almost 100 years old in this country. You were telling me that the House of Commons, it was created in the House of Commons in 1926. Would you mind just to tell us a bit of the history of this?
Yes.
Okay.
Across the world, there were many similar movements, such as the Canadian Legion, to remember the Great War. The war to end all wars.
Yeah, I
the
wish.
devastation. And of course, I'm going to put things a bit more in context, and I hope I don't lose track of where I'm going with this. But it just wasn't the 60,000 that were physically injured. Today, now we take into account the mental injuries. Back then, they didn't.
Right.
So
right.
how many more were mentally injured that were not documented? So
That's
perhaps
true.
double, triple, who knows, right? Okay.
PTSD you're talking about.
Correct. Okay. So, but imagine when those productive Canadians, plus many were in school, but many were working the farms and the factories, when they were drafted, and conscription did kick in the First World War, because we were still part of the British Empire, in 1914.
Mm-hmm.
And when Britain went to war, we went to war.
Yes.
Okay. And conscription kicked in and caused quite a political ruckus in Quebec, because they had, their own ideas. Fairly. Again, I should not have said that, but nevertheless, it was a political problem, but it was more of a social problem, because when those productive Canadians were drafted and taken out of the schools, teachers, for example, policemen, and I've already mentioned factory workers and farm workers, who was to take their places? I mean, our society still had to produce milk,
yes,
build machinery, and especially in the First World War and the Second, munitions, tanks, airplanes.
Yes. Very true.
If the young men are gone, who does it?
Yes.
Now, we're all familiar. We've seen the posters, the movies. Women became the army of productivity. They stepped in. And of course, he did a fantastic job at keeping this country going.
Yes.
As they are teaching and farming and taking care of the families, we don't take that into account as much as we should. So the impact of remembrance is the impact on our society as a whole. It's a holistic impact. Then I mentioned relatable. As the chair of the youth education program for the Dundas Legion, and as I now the zone chair, which covers Dundas and Burlington and Hamilton and Waterdown and Stony Creek, and only because my predecessors have passed. In the Royal Canadian Legion, people don't retire. And you know, this is very common with many organizations. I go a lot to the schools. We have a contest. We've had a contest for almost 50 years where we ask the students to contribute poems, essays, black and white posters, and color posters from grade 1 through grade 12. And these contributions are graded, they're marked, and they're awarded with recognition and prizes. And there's 5 different levels, including up to the national level, which we call Dominion. For example, when someone wins the color poster award, it gets framed and hung in the main hallway in House of Commons for a week. And that student gets brought up to Ottawa and meets the Governor General and is, you know, it's a big deal.
That's a big deal. Wow.
And it has been. And we have public speaking contests. I have chaired a number of Legion public speaking contests for the students. It's relatable. I've said that now, I think 3 times, because the message to today's students and teachers and families is we're all the same. The young person that went to war 120 years ago is you. You know, there's no difference. If that person was brought here right now and was seated next to you, you could talk as if you're talking about anything, about, you know, the weather, you know, mathematics, almost the same math. There's no difference. Often, and I like to mention one story. I walked into a school in Ancaster to award 2 children with their recognition awards. This was about 4 years ago. I was just, you know, I'm not assuming I would meet those students and their teachers and maybe their parents and maybe their friends, maybe in a hallway or maybe in a classroom, and, you know, talk for a few minutes and pass out their awards and their medals and, you know, a nice little envelope with cash, you know, and certificate. You know, it's a nice event, right? You know, and everyone just loves that kind of event. But however, the principal of the school had a different idea. She had a family school gathering in the school gymnasium for some other events, and she decided that she would make the Remembrance event the first keynote presentation of that. Wow. There were 600 people in that gymnasium. All generations, you know. There was kids in kindergarten going up to grade 8, their parents, their grandparents, teachers, of course. So with that age variety and diversity of age, the thought came across my mind: what is one message that's relatable to all? Because we're talking about people in that room that from the age of 5 to, who knows, 85, maybe older, maybe 90. What is the one message? And I had about 5 minutes to prepare it. So that's just, you know, and
I bet you did, though.
Well, it was easy in a sense. That if that is the hardest, riskiest task I have to face, I have no problem.
Here, here.
And so if you look, in my background, there's a helmet. So I think of the 17-year-old boy who puts on that helmet uniform and has a rifle, and the whistle blows and he has to go over the top, and he sees his friends being killed, and maybe that's what they had to face. And that's when the moment came. But what about all the days of being wet and hungry and scared, and artillery shells pounding away at him, and the sickness rolling through the trenches, the plagues, and being homesick, and and all I'm asked to do is to speak for a few minutes about them in front of people. That's not a big deal.
Yes, yes. Tony, it must have been so amazing for you to do this and do this for many people. But can I ask you, how are the schools today responding to Remembrance Day? Was that experience of which you just spoke indicative of what happens? And I'm just wondering how you're feeling about the school system today with Remembrance Day.
As in most things, there's not enough of the legacy of remembrance in schools. That's fairly common.
Mhm.
And it's actually much less than what I remember from my younger days. However, I do wish to assure you and your podcast viewers that remembrance in schools is very strong, and the flame is burning brightly
That's
in many
wonderful.
places in our society.
Wonderful.
Now, in the school system, Halloween comes first. Right? So the kids are all wound up.
Now that's scary. Yeah.
Yeah. They're all wound up for Halloween. But as soon as November the 1st hits,
Yep.
a switch flips, and a lot of teachers pull out their remembrance agenda and they get right to it.
That is amazing and wonderful. That is really special, because if we don't teach our children, who do we teach? So that's a wonderful thing.
And Neil, I go back to that story about the school with the 600 people in the gymnasium. The principal was so well versed with the Legion and Remembrance, and she stood up there and she spoke with passion.
Yes.
Everyone paid attention. You could have heard a pin drop.
Mm.
I had the feeling like, wow, this is something special to them.
Yes.
I had to live up to that. And that was a tremendous feeling. I have goosebumps now just thinking about that.
Me
and that's
too,
not
actually.
not an isolated case.
Mm-hmm.
This happens a lot. So remembrance is very strong in our schools.
Oh, this is wonderful. I remember as a child, we always took time to remember, and it was a very official day when I was a kid. Actually, I'm trying to remember if in my younger years, kindergarten to grade 6, if we even had the day off. We might have. I grew up in Kitchener, Waterloo, and I seem to remember it being a school holiday in those days, but I don't think that it is today. I was wondering, though, if you might talk about the significance of things that we know of from Remembrance Day, such as talk a little bit about the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Perhaps give us some education, please, on that.
Well, first off, it is a fact. It's not arbitrary. No one made this up. It happened to be that the ceasefire, First World War, was signed and agreed to the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918.
Wow.
So that's a fact. So that's said and done.
Yes.
And this was a world war, global war. So that is one fact that no one's going to argue with. It is, it's fate.
And it's carved in history.
Fact. Yes, it's a fact.
Hmm.
And it will be always will be a fact. It'll be one of those things that can never be changed by an arbitrary decision.
I hear you loud and clear, and therefore it's quite proper to remember it based in fact and in our history. Tell me, we were talking about the children, and I'm glad to hear that the schools are doing what they're doing, but general communities, Hamilton, Toronto, wherever you're familiar, is it a big observance still nowadays within the communities?
Fortunately and unfortunately, I have a good answer for that. And I say, unfortunately, is because it was due to the advent of those two people, two soldiers being killed in our country in 2014.
Yes.
I'm referring to Nathan Cirillo from Hamilton, who was
Correct.
standing at post in Ottawa and was gunned down by a terrorist.
Yes.
And I'm referring, respectfully to Warrant Officer Patrice Fitson, who was mowed down by a car, close to that time as well in 2014, and that was in Quebec. And that really got to Canadians. So that was an unfortunate advent. Now, fortunately, and I say this out of a literal sense, is that it showed me, it proved to me that under the layers of Canadian awareness of trying to get through life, there is a very strong emotional, heartfelt sense towards remembrance and towards the duty, because that year there was such a sentiment in this country that I had not seen before or after.
Yes.
But now the difference is I know it's there.
Yes.
Now, Neil, that Remembrance Day of 2014 was probably one of the most beautiful days of the year. And it was late November, early November 2011, late in the year, of course. It was like a spring day.
Mm-hmm.
I dressed in my uniform and I decided to walk towards the Legion branch in Dundas, which is about 2 kilometers. Nice day for a walk, left early. And I cut through the dog park, by Spencer Creek where I live, and through the streets in Dundas. And it was a journey of a lifetime. That 2-kilometer journey was full of people stopping me and thanking me. They saw the uniform and they rallied to the Legion uniform.
Wow.
And, they probably would never remember my face, but they'll remember the uniform. The first instance was in the dog park behind Spencer Creek. I took a shortcut, and a gentleman, of our generation, was walking his dog, and he was quiet, had his head down. He looked at me as I walked by, and he said, "Thank you for what you do." I did not expect that.
Yes.
I said,
yes.
"Thank you, sir." I continued on, and there was a number of such instances. The one that gets me, though, is on Market Street. There was a crew of city workers dressed in yellow slickers, and they had a pickup truck, and they were doing something with the catch basin. There was 4 of them. I walked along the sidewalk, and one of them, standing on the back of the pickup truck, looked at me and said, "Thank you for what you do."
Wow.
Same thing. And this is not rehearsed. And I said, "Thank you." But this was now probably my 3rd such instance on that journey.
Mm-hmm.
Walking home after remembrance ceremonies was the same thing. People stopped and said, "Thank you for what you do." They're talking not to me, and I know that. And they're cognizant there's a human being in this uniform. But they know what the Legion represents. They know what remembrance represents. They know what happened before. And because of those 2 tragedies that year, now it's near the top of the layers of their awareness.
It brought it to the surface, didn't it? Sorry, go more.
Canada has always, I believe, been like that.
Mm-hmm.
We don't wear necessarily our hearts in our sleeves unless it's hockey or something like that.
Yeah.
We're crazy that way, but it's there. And our contributions in the First World War with the high casualty ratios, and we got right into it, and the Second World War and the Korean police action, and Bosnia, Afghanistan. These are not places where we live.
Mm-hmm.
These are places where we die.
Yes. And Tony, it's fascinating what you said, and thank you for all of that, because I've been brought up, my parents brought me up to respect what has happened in the past and present and the future for our country. And if I see a police person or a paramedic or someone in military uniform, I just thank them. I just say hi, because they are doing something that at the end of the day results in trying to protect me, myself, and everybody in this country. And I think it's worth a thank you and an acknowledgement, because not everybody would do this. I often also think, and as I reflect on our military history in our country, we're a very peaceful people. Canada would rather not get involved, but if you involve us, and our great military has proven this in so many wars, that if we get involved, we're going to win and we're going to play a major role. And we are a strong country with great pride and great belief, like any other human who wants to go into a war. But we've always done our part as a country. And I've always been proud of that for our military. And like you said, Tony, the people at home who maybe aren't active in military, I just wanted to, if you would allow me, tell you, as a much younger man, I worked in the nuts and bolts and fastener industry. And I worked for many countries. And one of them, the factory was just recently torn down. It was in Milton. And they showed us, we went in the old factory from the Second World War. So what everybody saw was a factory making nuts and bolts and screws and stuff like that. But underneath were the women who were making bullets. And as the fasteners were loaded onto the trains, it was actually Canadian bullets going into the bottom of those train cars to be shipped to our brave military overseas. And I was honored to even have walked through that factory to see that. But who would have thought of it, that this was going on?
I like to mention something that's very relevant to what you and I are talking about. And this is actually like a paradox or an oxymoron. I'd like to talk briefly about when we did not go to war.
Sure.
This was the Second Gulf War. This is the war that a lot of us think was not necessary, where the American president at the time came up allegedly with some lame excuses to go and attack Iraq. Okay. Correct. The second, now we contributed in the first Gulf War after Kuwait was invaded. Sure. But the second Gulf War, our prime minister, it doesn't matter about the political affiliations.
Correct.
Our prime minister stood up and said, no, we will not sacrifice Canadian lives for something we do not believe in.
Yes.
He stood up against the United States and Great Britain and other countries that got onto this. You know, it's not for me to say a scam or whatever, you know, it's Correct. Not for me to judge, but our government would not throw the young lives away for nothing.
Exactly.
And that makes us unique amongst the so-called modern countries.
Well,
I'm proud.
And we should all be. And it's very interesting, Tony, because what you're talking about is leadership. I believe in leadership. I mean, I asked you to come on because you're a leader and you're a mentor and you're an educator. But we always have to have strong leadership in whatever endeavor we go into, business, personal, but in the military. We have to have it. And that's a very interesting and very important comment that you just made about the leadership of our military.
Another example, and this time a prime minister of the opposite political affiliation later,
yes,
was at a NATO meeting somewhere, and he was approached by a French general who kind of mocked him, saying, you know, what do Canadians expect from their contributions? You know, is Canada becoming some kind of an imperialistic nation? You know, there was some kind of, I think he was talking about Afghanistan or something. And the prime minister flatly replied, only a place to bury our soldiers away from home.
Yeah.
You know, you just stop the train.
Yeah. And well done. Like I said in my comments, Canada you don't want to annoy Canada because we will get involved and we will do our role, but we would rather not. And I believe that we've had great leadership in our country and in our military. Tony, I'd like to ask you something about, I had all these questions to ask you, but you're so good. You've covered off so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you're enjoying this, because this is a tribute to our men and women who have saved our lives, and unfortunately may have to in the future again. But Tony, there was a poem written by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae on 3rd of May 1915, of course, in Flanders Fields. So now we're 108 years since then. And yet that poem, along with this poppy, these are what people look to on Remembrance Day. Can you comment on the poem, and also tell us the poppy? Why do we wear it? Why is that our symbol?
I am fascinated with that poem. Officially, it's known as a sonnet. And you'll notice it doesn't rhyme, and it was never meant to rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
And quite often, when people read it, they read it. And, and it's something they do maybe once a year, and that's fine. Okay, as long as they read it. But it was not meant to be read that way.
Uh-huh.
It was meant to be read the way that someone from the grave would talk.
Oh,
see. Yeah. So if you look at it and really look at it, and you read it, and then you stop and think, how would they read it? The departed ones who died. Okay, that was where the intention was. And I'll get to the part where where the sonnet says, we loved and we were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. I think, I've thought about that for years. Like, wow, and to you, we passed the torch, and if it's read with the proper inflections and the pauses, it would be very dramatic.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And traumatic. And a lot of people know when I can see from your reaction, what I'm saying.
Yes.
A lot of people understand that. And that is the power of this poem after all these years.
Mm-hmm.
That we are being spoken to from the soldiers in their graves.
Wow.
Now the poppy itself, it's when the fields in Flanders and France and elsewhere were pounded by artillery over and over and over and over. It was not possible for anything to grow, but the poppies grew. And the symbolism of the poppy is blood, right? Blood. I point to both sides of my body, blood, because that's what grew.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The only thing that came out of that ground at that time was blood, and the poppies commemorated the blood of the fallen.
My God.
Young boys and women, nurses, back in the First World War and today in front lines, and really on both sides.
Yes.
Really, right? On both sides. And not the same farm boys, the same young nurses, right? Who didn't care about the politics, but were told to go here.
You go. Yeah.
You go.
The insanity of it all.
Because quite often with Canada being a multicultural country that we officially became in 1967.
Yes.
Guaranteed by the Charter of Rights in 1982. Right? In our society, we have people from Germany, and other Italy and other Japan and other countries that we fought against, right? But they're as Canadian as you and me. So when I am aware of this. So when I go to the schools, I am aware of the multicultural facets of our society. So I don't speak about war, good guys versus bad guys. I talk about young men and women who didn't come home and the families that were devastated.
Yes.
And in our Canadian society, and I'm going to refer to what you talked about earlier, I refer to the values they fought and died for, the values to criticize the government, the value not to be afraid of the police. Of course, we have our bad stories, but
Sure.
99.999%, it's true. We don't have to be afraid if we see a police officer in the streets.
Correct.
Not every country can say that. These are the values that they fought for, whether they knew it or not, but they died for.
Yes. Yes.
And so therefore, referring back to what you have spoken about, Neil, yes, when I see a police officer, fireman, a teacher, anyone who goes out of their way to make our society better, I try to think of the values. Now, of course, my life is busy like yours and everyone else's, and I'll have my headaches and my grievances like we all do as human beings. But we, especially those in the Legion, will make a daily effort to remember our values and to convey that story to our society. And I wish to assure you and your viewers from your podcast, Canadian society does respond very positively.
Well, Tony, I want to thank you so much for coming on today. I just wanted to remember Remembrance Day, and I do. But ladies and gentlemen, on Remembrance Day this year, as Tony said, we're all busy. We have things on our minds. But every single thing that we're doing is because we have the freedom to do it, because other people made sure that we have it. And I, for one, try every day to do something to maintain the freedoms in this country for the next generation. Tony, you are one of those people. I am so thrilled that I had the privilege of being introduced to you. Thank you for coming on to Your Gray Matters podcast. And ladies and gentlemen, of course, we'll be back next week, but this week at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, no matter what you're doing, stop and remember in your own way.
And I will sum it up by saying remembrance is about you, Neil, your son Jason, and every single person in this podcast. Remembrance is about you and the values that we live for today because of those that went before us. So thank you to everyone for being who you are.
And thank you very much. One last thing, ladies and gentlemen, please don't be afraid to buy poppies. I'm going to be wearing this, I don't know if you can see it, cool armband. I got it from a member of the Legion this week. That's a volunteer standing there, still fighting on our behalf. And we can do our thing by simply buying a poppy and wearing it, or a commemoration of Remembrance Day. We haven't been called to the front like so many people, but we have the privilege and the honor to live here and to support our legions and just wear this. I'm going to learn how to do this. There you go. Learn to wear this. Bless your heart, Tony. You are really terrific, and I hope that I will see you again soon. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for tuning in. Bye, everybody.